Okay, let's talk about where modes come from. Now, this will be a little bit of a break from music theory. This is just kind of a little history lesson, but it's kind of fascinating to me, and hopefully to you. So, let's talk about it. The church modes are old. They go way back. They are older than the major and the minor scales. Um, we can trace them back to about 350 BC, a long, long time ago. So that's, you know, well over almost 2,350 years ago, 360 years ago, long time ago. Their names, I already told you the names, or Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, and Locrian. Their names go back to the Greeks. You may have guessed those are Greek sounding names, I guess. And they're named after different regions, um, or ethnic regions in ancient Greece. Um, some of those places, I believe, still exist. I think I recently saw on a map something with the name something like Ionia. Yeah, I think that still exists actually. Uh, Geography is not my thing, but so let's move on. Now, way back then, we get Plato and Aristotle actually writing a little bit about the church modes. They actually commented on these things and what they did. I'm going to read you one little quote here, and this is from Aristotle's Politics. The musical modes differ essentially from one another, and those who hear them are differently affected by each. Some of them make men sad and grave, like the so-called Mixolydian. Others enfeeble the mind, like the relaxed modes. Another, again, produces a moderate or settled temper, which appears to be the particular effect of the Dorian. And the Phrygian inspires enthusiasm. So, really, kind of what he's saying here is that the modes were used to directly affect people. So, what would happen would be the modes were kind of in a way like medicine. So, if you were feeling lethargic, someone might play for you Phrygian. And the idea was Phrygian was the mode for enthusiasm. It would fix what's physically wrong with you. There's a lot of stories about this kind of thing, about how the modes affected people very directly in ways that, scales and music and different keys and modes and things don't really affect us anymore. And maybe these stories are mythology. Some of them almost certainly are. There are all kinds of odd stories about, how the modes were used to build the pyramids and all these things that are, really mythology. But some of them might be factual. One of my favorite stories about this affect with the modes is a story about there was a king who had his army was about to go into battle, and he called up the court musician and said, "We're about to go into battle. I want you to play probably, I don't remember the exact modes, but I'm going to guess probably could be Phrygian, something that the mode for battle and war. There's one mode that supposedly enrages you and gets you ready for battle, right? So the king says, "I want you to play that music in that mode for the troops to get them ready for battle." But the musician screwed up. So what the court musician did, he accidentally played music in a mode that was not intended for riling up the troops to send them into war, but instead was intended for to be played for adults before certain adult activities. Let's just say a very amorous kind of mode. He played that for the troops instead. My guess would be that would be Lydian, but so the troops didn't do so well. They obviously lost the battle because they were preoccupied with something else, and it was a bloodbath. This is just one of the many stories about how these modes affected people back then. Now, you might argue that it could be true that modes affected people that powerfully back then because they were much more sensitive to it because they weren't hearing music all the time like we are in our society. So in our society, we're like always hearing music. So perhaps our senses towards these kinds of things have dulled quite a bit. That's one argument for it. That's a whole other can of worms that we're not going to go into. Anyway, so ancient Greeks, they have the modes. Now, we don't really know historically if what they called the modes is the same as what we now call the modes. The names are probably kind of jumbled from where they were. And what notes are what is probably a little different. There's some historic things that went different. But let's jump ahead about 400 years. And what's now happening in the early Christian church is that all music, and actually art in general, but music is being associated with different events in the Christian tradition. So there's music for this kind of service, there's music for that kind of service, and particularly in like a mass and things like that. So the modes get used to be kind of the thing that differentiates the different church services. Because pretty much all music back in this time was run by the church. The church kind of had a monopoly on music making and definitely music writing at the time. So we had music like this that you're seeing on the screen. This is chant, and this music that you're hearing. This is kind of how it was notated. It kind of looks similar, right, to what we're looking at. There's only 4 lines, and there are these little squares, but you can kind of see a flat symbol. You can see some other stuff. I'm not going to go into how to read this. It's actually fairly complicated, but this is kind of an early predecessor to our kind of notation, and it uses modes. So what they're doing here is showing, yes, you're singing all of the pitches, which we could call, for the sake of argument, the C major scale, but then this one is altered, and that gets you to a certain mode, something like that. So the church kind of adopts all the Greek modes and makes them for specific events, which is why they get called the church modes. At that time, I believe they didn't use the Greek names. They used just kind of, they called them mode 1, mode 2, mode 3, etc. I don't know at what point we went back to using the Greek terms. Probably not until like the 1900s or so, I would guess. Like much, much later. But bring us way forward into modern times. Around 1940s and 50s, composers started, of like orchestral music and chamber music, started using the modes again in secular, non-religious music because they liked the sound of them, they liked the difference of them, as opposed to just the major and minor scale. They were more colorful. They gave them more options, and so they really kind of came back. And now they're very common to hear in music of all types. So that's why they're still relevant to us. They're not just a historic relic from Gregorian chant, you know? But whenever you hear Gregorian chant, the odds are you are probably hearing them singing in a mode. So that's kind of the quick history lesson. One other interesting thing is that there is one mode, and I always like to tell this story because all my students kind of perk up when I say it. There's one mode that was considered kind of like the devil's mode. This is the bad one, the one you don't play if you're in a church setting. Of the church modes, this is the one that got you burned at the stake, or more commonly, I've read, your head chopped off for playing this mode. If you were a church musician and you accidentally played this mode, you were in big, big trouble. This is the mode called Locrian. And we're going to talk about it, and we're going to play it. But no one's going to get their head chopped off. That's a long ago thing. Okay, so now that we know kind of how to find our modes, a little bit about what they are, and the history of them, let's jump into the Ionian mode and talk through that one.